You're at the Detroit Historical Museum right now. So thank you all for visiting us today. We're really excited to have you with us. You guys are going to receive a tour of our museum today, and our museum talks all about the history of Detroit. So we have galleries that go all the way back to talking about the very first people that lived here thousands of years ago. We have galleries that talk about our auto industry. We have our streets of old Detroit, which are down here, which makes it feel like you're back in the 1800s. So we have all sorts of different things that talk about different events and timelines in Detroit's history. So you're going to be getting a tour with one of my guides back there. And then after that, you'll have some time to explore the museum and also kind of see some things that maybe might pique your interest too, okay? Before I split us up into groups, just a couple of rules to remember while you're with us at the museum today. So the first thing is please make sure that you stay together. We are open to the public today, so that means that we have people who are from around and we have adults who are strangers here, so we just want to make sure that you're safe. So please make sure that you stay with your adults at all times. Please also make sure that if you have any sort of candy or food or gum or anything like that, that it stays in your bag or stays in here. The reason that we ask that is that we don't want to attract bugs in our museum because we have lots and lots of old things that are really, really cool, and we don't want anything to attract bugs that will destroy that, okay? The next thing is related to that, we have a lot of really fantastic things in our museum that are really, really cool. You might get really excited to see them, but also please keep in mind that if you see something behind glass, or if it has a rope in front of it, or if it has a sign that says, please do not touch, we're going to keep our hands off of that. But there are lots of things in this museum that you can touch that will be very obvious to you. We have lots of buttons that you can push. We have some games and stuff that you can play and stuff like that. So those are the things that you can touch while you're in the museum. And then the very last thing is please make sure that you keep your use your walking feet and also use your inside voices today. Again, just because we're open to the public and I want to keep you safe and our other guests safe as well. Does anyone have any questions before we get started today? All right. So the other thing too, since I know that you guys are part of your student government and you're learning more about your local history, if you guys have any questions during your tour, please feel free to ask our guide. We want to help you understand whatever it is that you're trying to better understand. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to split up into two groups. So however that works best for you guys, we'll get started then.
Of old Detroit. So this is going to be a little bit different than the other exhibits you'll look at while you're here, because most of the other exhibits, they'll kind of tell you what Detroit was like in the past, where this one really tries to show you what Detroit looked like a long time ago. So we are currently in the 1840s. We actually passed through a few time periods. We started in the 1900s, which was 126 years ago. We moved to the 1870s, 156 years ago, and now we're in the 1840s, 186 years ago. So looking around here, what do you see that's different from the Detroit you know today?
So
the streets are made out of very different material than they used to be. Nowadays we have these concrete and asphalt streets. Here we actually have a type of road called cobblestone. And so a bunch of different rocks of different shapes and sizes all cobbled together into a single road. And these are not the best to walk on, but they are better than what they had before, which was dirt roads, because when it rains, the dirt roads get muddy, and there are stories about children needing a horse to even cross the street, where they would just sink right into the mud. Clothing. And there's a few different things that are different about this. The suit styles are different. The hats are made out of beaver fur, which we'll talk more about later, but fur hats are just not so stylish as they used to be now. And then there's also a sign there that says ready-made clothing. Do you guys ever see a sign that says ready-made clothing on clothing stores today? No, because that's something that we expect now. That clothing, when you walk into a clothing store, the clothing there will have been produced already. It's already ready for you. But at this time in the 1840s, that's still kind of a new idea. The idea of there being clothing in small, medium, and large, and all of these sizes. So that's a new thing as well. There was the War of 1812 happened a few decades before this, and that was when people really started wearing sizes of uniforms, small, medium, and large. And when the war ended, they started wearing that in civilian life too. Another thing, some things here are actually the same as they are. There's some businesses at this time that are still around, like the Detroit Savings Fund Institute is now Comerica Bank, and over there the Democratic Free Press is now called the Detroit Free Press. But at this time in the 1840s, being the Democratic Free Press meant they supported the Democratic Party, which meant they were kind of pro-slavery at a time when this was a major debate happening in the United States. So the Democratic Free Press was actually one of the last places to have someone enslaved working for there, a man named Hector, and it was run by John John R. Williams, who was very heavily anti-abolition. He was very against the abolition of slavery and would publish articles criticizing the Underground Railroad, which was something major that was happening in Detroit at this point. You can actually see that over there. And even before slavery was gone in British Canada, people were escaping the other way, but at this point it's just going one way, people crossing that river to escape from the United States and get to Canada. And so because Detroit is so close to Canada, it's an important part of this Underground Railroad, this movement of people from slavery into freedom in places like Canada. And Detroit gets a nickname. It's called Midnight, which is the last stop before dawn. That's freedom in Canada. So we have lots of people in Detroit crossing the river with help from the African American, African Canadian communities to get to freedom in Canada. And people such as the Democratic Free Press oppose this, but was still kind of this major force in anti-slavery activism at this point in time. Now, looking at these streetlights here, are there any guesses about what these two poles on either side are used for? That's a good guess. Sometimes they would be used for decoration. Any other guesses? Yeah, they could be used for hanging clothes as well, but these are used for ladders. You would take a ladder and you would lean against there, and that's how you would climb up and light the lights every single night. Because unlike the ones we have here, these ones would not have actually had electricity. They would be using whale oil brought in from the East Coast, and people would be lighting those every night in order to light the streets. And so that works a little bit differently. Someone had to be a lamplighter and do that job every single night. And another difference is that nowadays streetlights are kind of spread out evenly throughout the city, but at this time you would actually have to pay to get a streetlight installed in front of your business. So they were all kind of scattered around, so it wasn't really that helpful for being able to see at nights. One more thing I want to point out is that blacksmith shop over there. How many of you have played Minecraft before? Yeah, a few of you. Can any of you tell me something you can make out of iron? Yep, swords, spears, other kinds of weapons. Anything else? Make a what?
Armor.
Yep, iron armor, protect yourself against those weapons. Yep, you can make mine carts, different forms of transportation. You can also use them to make train cars and cars later on, and kind of boats as well. So iron is very useful for a lot of different things, especially in a city like this. At this point, they don't have cars, but they do have horses, and horses are using iron horseshoes. So you guys can actually walk around inside the blacksmith shop for a moment to kind of see what people are making out of iron at this point. It's iron tools against. At this point in time, the blacksmith shop is going to be this all tool store, making things for like farm tools, like tools for traveling around, iron to line wheels, horseshoes, all these other things people need when they're working as farmers or merchants or these other things in this very early city of Detroit. At this point, Detroit is barely a city. There's only about 9,000 people living here, and a lot of people are just farmers living around the city. But as people start making more things out of iron in these large factories, Detroit is going to grow very quickly. Are there any questions about the 1840s? All right. And they would just kind of be picking up those buckets and passing over the water, and this would lead to a lot of water spilling and the fire not actually getting out. So it was not the most efficient method. And then later on, we have volunteer fire departments. And that sounds good, but how that actually worked was only the team that got to the fire fastest would get paid. So it was all these volunteer fire groups fighting each other over who got to get paid, and the fire is not actually getting out the most efficiently. And then over here, we have finally in the 1870s, an official city fire department that kind of runs a lot more efficiently than these older, more informal forms of fire. Now, they still don't have cars that can move these vehicles on their own, so instead this is a horse-drawn fire carriage. 3 or 4 horses would kind of get tied up here, and they would pull the fire cart around to wherever the fire was happening. And so they had kind of these stables as well in the fire department to take care of the horses in between these long treks. So you guys can actually walk around the inside of here in a bit and see how it's similar and different than modern fire engines. Big avenues and kind of similar design to the city of Paris, as well as all these fancy goods that are getting sold in places like the fancy goods shops over there and these other antique stores. We also have this very fancy hotel called the Russell House, and this is the fanciest place in Detroit. This is where people like the Prince of Wales will stay while they're visiting Detroit. Over here in the back is Albert Hill, and he is a barber at this time, and he's able to actually become a successful politician because of the connections he makes with the important clientele passing into his barbershop. One thing I'll note there is you probably recognize that symbol from barbershops today as well. The barbershop pole has red and white, representing blood and bandages, because barbers used to, as well as cutting hair, they would also do surgery. So that's kind of representing their past, even though even here in the 1870s, that's not what barbers are really doing as much anymore, except maybe specifically in the army. One thing I want to point out that's a bit of museum history is those two green buildings we have here, the Sanders Confection, the Fancy Goods Shop. Those were actually taken from the neighborhood of Black Bottom here in Detroit. Have any of you heard of Black Bottom neighborhoods? So Black Bottom neighborhood was kind of one of the biggest and most prosperous black neighborhoods in Detroit up until the 1950s when urban renewal happened, which was when a lot of minority neighborhoods were getting destroyed in order to create highway systems through the city of Detroit, the modern highway system we have today. And so Black Bottom's neighborhood was destroyed in the 1950s, which was the same time this exhibit was getting built. So as the neighborhood was getting destroyed, they actually took some buildings from the neighborhood and put them in here to repurpose them as buildings from the 1870s, even though these were buildings that existed in the 1950s. So kind of a little bit that shows you how this museum was affected by changes happening in the city of Detroit that at this point are history to us. Now, is there any other questions about the You want to have a really good health system. So you got to have a lot of pharmacies like the one we're in right now to kind of help treat injuries people get while working on these assembly lines, which are very dangerous, and also to just keep it spread all over the world and affect cities like Detroit as well. So you're going to want to have a lot of pharmacies like the one we're inside to help deal with that. Now, pharmacies today work a bit differently than pharmacies did at this point. Nowadays, when you go to a pharmacy, you're going to have a pre-written prescription, something your doctor telling you what to get that will already be ready for you when you walk in, or maybe you'll be able to buy some stuff off of the shelf if they're considered safe enough to be bought over the counter. But at this point, pharmacies worked a bit differently. All the way behind me, these are not finished medicines, these are ingredients of medicines. The pharmacist would kind of hear what your issue was, or maybe have a customized medicine just for your family, and would mix these ingredients together in front of you, turn them into pills or a liquid to bring home, and then you would be kind of getting these medicines not ready-made. There were also some ready-made medicines like the brands you can see up there, and also patent medicines. Have you guys ever heard of snake oil salesmen? So that's, if you hear kind of like a Wild West story, a snake oil salesman is someone who's kind of traveling around and he's selling these medicines that are kind of made up. He's saying, this is a miracle cure for this is a miracle cure for that, and he sells it to you, and maybe it even makes you sicker, it doesn't work, he's just trying to make a quick buck. And that's what patent medicines were at this point. There weren't as many rules about what kind of medicines you could sell people and how to make sure it actually worked, so you could just kind of whip up whatever, say it would cure this disease, and sell it to people, and then try to make money before people figured out it didn't actually work. So that was a big problem in medicine at this point, people just kind of making up fake medicines and selling them to people. So a few different things are called Nickelodeon at this point, and they all are different kinds of entertainments. So a Nickelodeon is a movie, so a machine that's kind of like a jukebox from later on in history, where you can put in money and it'll play music. It's also a way to get around rules on gambling, because the machine, there's a lot of rules against gambling at this point, and the machine kind of lets people gamble in a way that just skirts those laws slightly. So that's kind of another form of entertainment that's being used in that machine. Then on the wall there we have a phone. This phone, you would listen in this part, talk into that part, but do you see any part to dial numbers? No. Instead, you turn that crank on the side and that dials someone directly called the operator. And the operator is sitting at a panel full of numbers and wires, and you tell the operator, I want to talk to my friend James Smith in Chicago, and the operator will actually connect you together directly. So that you have to kind of go through a middleman in order to talk to people, because there isn't kind of that same network of cell phone connections, liquid with food coloring or some sort of resin that's dyed, but it's there to represent medicine. Just like the barber pole we saw earlier, every store is going to have some way that they tell people what it is, even if they can't read the signs. Because here in Detroit, as throughout much of Detroit's history, the majority of people living and working in this city are not from Detroit. They're from other countries. They might have previously been enslaved in the South and not allowed to learn to read and write. They might be from a country where they don't read or write English at all. And they might also just not be 1600s. And they're killing so many beavers to turn to hats that they're running out of beavers to kill to turn to hats. So when they cross the Atlantic Ocean and are part of this larger colonization, they're very excited there are a lot of beavers around that they can use to turn to hats and kind of continue this fur trade industry. So instead of kind of going around the area and trying to find them themselves, the French, they start trading with the Anishinaabe. And this is how Detroit gets started. The French set up a place called Fort Pontchartrain du Détroit. So Détroit meaning on the strait, so kind of a skinny little strip of water that we refer to as the Detroit River. And so they set up this fort as a way to kind of trade with the Anishinaabe while fending off attacks from their enemies like the British, who are also in this region trying to kind of take over land and get these furs to kind of make a lot of money on this fur trade. The French are forced out of this area in what's called the French and Indian War, as what the British call it, because the French and their native allies are teaming up against the British, but the British ultimately win this conflict. And one of the British soldiers involved in this conflict is George Washington, who will later on kind of help lead this American Revolution that will kind of change hands of this place again. Before that, there's something called Pontiac's War. Have you guys heard of Pontiac? So Pontiac is one of the leaders of the Odawa, and he does not like when the British take over this area. Because the French were interested in kind of having actual trade agreements. They would give gifts, which is kind of important on Anishinaabe culture when you're doing a trade agreement. They would marry into indigenous families in order to create these strong connections. So they were more interested in kind of playing by the rules of diplomacy in the Great Lakes region. But the British were not as interested in that. They were kind of leading to all these conflicts. They were mistreating their trading partners. So Pontiac and various other members of the Anishinaabe, the native people, kind of rise up against the British to try to force them out of the region. They're ultimately unsuccessful, but they are able to kind of get the British to be more respectful trading partners moving forward. But then George Washington and his other British allies ultimately decide to do the American Revolution and leave the British Empire. And from there, things do get significantly worse, as the Americans are a lot less interested in continuing the trade and more interested in kind of taking over the land in order to kind of use it for their own purposes. So there would be a lot more conflict in this region because of that moving forwards. Now, over here, involved. So the British still don't really respect the Americans as a country, so there's another conflict between the British and the Americans, and Detroit gets very heavily involved, because like we mentioned downstairs, we're right along that border with Canada. And the British actually take over Detroit, led by Isaac Brock, and with the aid of Tecumseh, who along with his brother Idrees Mutahar has made this big Native American alliance across this region to kind of try to push back against the Americans. So they take over Detroit temporarily, but ultimately the war kind of ends in a bit of a stalemate and returns to American control. And then they're going to wind up in Michigan or Ohio. And there was a belief at this point that because Toledo is a port city right along Lake Erie, it was going to be one of the most important cities of the following century. So both Michigan and Ohio wanted to have it. So they have kind of this little miniature war called the Toledo War, where Michigan soldiers will like beat up Ohio soldiers in taverns. They'll like fire their cannons over walls to scare the other one. There was only one casualty, only one injury, which is when a Michigan sheriff got stabbed with a penknife by an Ohio guy named Two Stickney, who there's actually a road named after in Toledo today. And moving into this time period, it's going to be these big things made in factories like stoves and ships and railroad cars that are really going to define Detroit at this point. And you can kind of look around this area and see. Seen this flag before, which is a little weird because this is the official flag of the city of Detroit, one of the most important cities in the country. One reason why maybe a lot of people haven't seen this flag before might be because it's often been voted one of the ugliest flags in the world. Do you agree or disagree on that? Yeah, why do you agree?
Because look, first, they first copying Manchester United, right? And it looks like America, like it kind of does. You see how it's red?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're noticing it is actually copying a lot of different flags.
Like to launch, it's basically like four countries in one.
Yeah, so you're noticing there's got a lot of different things going on in this flag. Anyone disagree that the flag is ugly?
I'm not to talk about that flag's pretty.
Okay, yeah, so some people think it looks pretty even if it's a little bit chaotic. And I like the flag because it kind of tells us a lot about Detroit's history. You were actually correct, that's actually a bunch of different flags all put together. So in this bottom part, this is the flag of France. So this symbol is called the fleur de lis, and that's lily flower in French, and that represents French control of Detroit. And then you might have been thinking of Manchester United because those lions are associated with England. So this is representing that fire I mentioned earlier, Detroit's fire of 1805, when the whole city burns down. The city isn't really much of a city at this point, just kind of a few streets of small wooden buildings that aren't very fire safe. But the whole city burns down, and we have these women here representing how Detroiters felt about this. Engine on so it could drive on its own. What's different about this car compared to modern cars?
The wheels are
Yeah, the wheels are really big compared to the rest of the car, and you might have noticed that with the horse-drawn carriage we saw downstairs, the fire carriage, the wheels are also just very large compared to the rest of it, where today the kind of proportion between wheels and body of the car is a bit more equal.
Speed.
Slower than 20, a little faster than 5. Yeah, 6. So this one goes 6 miles per hour at its fastest speed. So not even really going to beat the horses that you have at this point. Something else to point out, we have that car that is from the 60s and this car. If you saw these two next to each other in the dealership, which one would you want to buy more? Okay, so now we will have to stand here and we will have to watch the video until it's done. It's very loud. An experiment made by one guy. This is one that's being made really quickly with that assembly line behind you. And because of the assembly line, they're able to make these very quickly, and they don't have to pay workers as much because they're making it so quickly, so fewer hours for workers. And so they are making this, and they're able to make it more affordable than other cars of the past because their costs of making it are a lot lower than the other cars you might have seen back there. So this car is really important because it kind of changes the history of cars. Before then, they were more of a luxury for very wealthy people to be able to buy. By this point, more and more car companies are making cars that are affordable enough even for the assembly line workers themselves to make. So here in the kind of early 1900s, you're going to see lots of changes from the rise of the car industry. Now, are there any questions about anything we've covered on the tour? All right, so at this point, you guys will get an opportunity to kind of explore the rest of the museum. We have the Motor City Music and Gallery of Culture back there. Upstairs, we have a lot of exhibits about various topics in Detroit's history. And downstairs, we have the comic book exhibit, the train room, and a few other spaces to check out.
and what planners do, generally speaking. And then we'll focus specifically and talk specifically about the Greenway in this project and how it came to be. Does that sound good to everyone? Okay, so I work at the City of Detroit. I work for the General Services Department, is the name of my department, as the lead Greenway planner. So greenways across the city, I focus on sort of the initial step before they go to construction of coming up with the ideas, raising money for them, and doing community engagement. But before we jump into all of that, I'm kind of curious how much you guys know about, or I'll give you guys a little intro to how city government works. Can anyone tell me, I think a good parallel is between the city government and the United States government. Does anyone know how does the U.S. federal government work? What are sort of the big pieces of the U.S. government? Can I get Okay, great. Yes, so maybe you guys have some insight. That there's a Congress, that there's a president. The U.S. Constitution, exactly, right? So I think it's a good example because everyone knows the U.S. Constitution, the three branches of government.
How do you say get rid?
I think it's when you get to like the states have one legislature instead of two bodies. Like, you know how at the federal government you have the Senate and the House? Some states, they just have one legislative chamber. So every state has its own rules and every state has its own constitution. And that constitution dictates also beneath the state government how the local governments can be organized. So the Michigan Constitution says local governments have these responsibilities and they can do these things. Others. So instead of a constitution, the city of Detroit has a city charter, is what it's called. It does the same thing. It's a document that outlines how the government is structured. And in the city of Detroit, you have the mayor, who's the legislative body, and then you have the mayor, which is the executive body, and the city council, which is the legislative body. My role as a city planner, I work in Parks and Recreation under the mayor. So the mayor is technically my boss. Now, I don't report to her directly. There's a few steps down, but it's similar in that the mayor has a cabinet, just like the president of the United States. So Mayor Sheffield, she has a director of the General Services Department, a director of the Department of Public Works that oversees roads, a director of the Water Department, making an amendment to the Constitution. And instead of having a citywide council where they're elected at large, it's now elected by district. And there's 7 districts in the city of Detroit. So the government can change. You know, if we decide we want to rewrite the rules, we want to organize it a different way, you can do so. That's very high level. But that kind of gives you an idea of how things work. So the mayor and those of us who work for the mayor, we're in charge of actually doing the work of making things happen in the city, of building the parks, maintaining the parks, planning parks and roads, the bus system, the water system. And all of us are kind of in the day-to-day doing the nitty-gritty of making these things happen. And then city council is sort of a legislative body. They kind of approve the laws of the city, so the city code, and they also approve the budget. So the mayor can say, hey, I want to spend this much on these different things, but she can't just do that on her own. She has to get it approved by the council. So there's similar checks, kind of like how there is at the federal level. So that's a little bit of background on city government and how I fit into it. Making an amendment to the Constitution, and instead of having a citywide council where they're elected at large, it's now elected by district, and there's 7 districts in the city of Detroit. So the government can change. You know, if we decide we want to rewrite the rules, we want to organize it a different way, you can do that, and you can change the charter. So that's very high level, but that kind of gives you an idea of how things work. So the mayor and those of us who work for the mayor, we're in charge of actually doing the work of making things happen in the city, of building the parks, maintaining the parks, planning parks and roads, the bus system, the water system. And all of us are kind of in the day-to-day doing the nitty-gritty of making these things happen. And then city council is sort of a legislative body. They kind of approve the laws of the city, so the city code, and they also approve the budget. So the mayor can say, hey, I want to spend this much on these different things, but she can't just do that on her own. She has to get it approved by the council. So there's similar checks, kind of like how there is at the federal level. So that's a little bit of background on city government and how I fit in. Planners are people that make decisions about the future of the city. And it can be very broad, but just so that the administration is not making decisions at random, we're thinking about what the city needs, what the city currently has, and how we can make it better. So for example, if you think about, I'm sort of within the parks division, and there's a group of about 5 park planners. There's a document called and doing an assessment. So this park is in good shape. This park is not doing so well. It hasn't really seen any improvements in a really long time. And then we also talk with the community about like, what kind of things do people need? Is this a community where people play soccer a lot? We want to hear from people who live there about what they actually want to see in their city services. So we take all those different elements, and it helps us identify where we want to spend the money. Essentially, at the end of the day, we have limited money as a city, especially in the city of Detroit. So we can't spend money on every single park every year. So, okay, we have this limited budget that was allocated by the mayor, approved by city council, and we have to decide how to spend it. So as planners, we help create a plan for how to spend those dollars most effectively. Does that all make sense? So we're trying to come up with a plan, essentially, for how this money can be spent. There's planners who do parks work, there's planners who do roads work. So if you see something like a new road being paved, there's people who came up with the strategy for which road got paved that year, right? And so there's planners involved in all these different areas. And I specifically work on greenway planning, so working on the city's bike and pedestrian network. So if you see today, you're on this property, the Joe Louis Greenway. It's what we're working on is a 30-mile loop around the city of Detroit for bikes and pedestrians, essentially a trail. Have you guys been to the Riverwalk before, or the DeQuinder Cut? They're nice public spaces, but they also function as a way to get around, a place for you to walk, a place for you to ride your bike. They connect communities, and so it's kind of serving this double purpose of moving people, but also creating good public space, green space in the neighborhood. Any questions about that before I dig more into the Joe Louis Greenway specifically? I feel like I've talked a lot. Okay, does that all make sense to you guys? So on your flyer that I passed out, it's got some basic information about the Greenway project. You can see some of the areas that are complete, some of the areas that are still under construction or funded, and some of the areas that are dashed where we're still doing planning work. We're still figuring out what it'll look like, how we'll fund it, whether it's local money or, oftentimes we go get money from the federal government or the state government.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How much money do you have at them? I think read.
How much money do we get? Well, it's
Like, and we'll get it.
so there's not an allocated budget for greenways.
Like, I can ask them, man, like, what should be represented? I like a last.
Yeah, so I think I can answer that question, but it's going to be a little bit of a roundabout answer. So I'll tell you through the Joe Louis Greenway came out of this plan that was published in 2021. Neighborhood along the Greenway, so 23 neighborhoods, 4 council districts, and 3 cities, Hamtramck, Highland Park, and Dearborn. And they helped us come up with this plan that basically outlined this route. And through that, we were able to estimate how much the Greenway is going to cost. So to date, we raised about $220 million. And then we still have about another $80 million that we need to raise to finish the project. So it's about $300 million, which is not a small amount of money. It's a pretty big, this is one of the most ambitious Greenway projects in the United States. So if you look at Atlanta, for example, they have the Atlanta Beltline. Other cities like Minneapolis or New York City have the High Line. They have the Midtown Greenway in Minneapolis. So this is modeled after a lot of other projects that we learned from, but we're trying to do it in a Detroit context, and we're trying to do it to meet residents' needs, things that we learned from the community in that framework plan, during that framework planning process. So I think a little bit of context about where we are today. So you might say, why did you decide on this route? You're actually on what used to be an old railroad. You're on the site of the former Detroit Terminal Railroad. So back starting in the 1920s, about 100 years ago, the city built a rail line that went in a big loop around the city. It was covered in tires. And so seeing what other cities were doing with their old railroads, this is a pretty common practice around the US. There are a lot of cities that, there's not as much room in the street or there's not a lot of open land for building a path like this in neighborhoods. Rail lines, especially ones that have been abandoned in a lot of American cities that were deindustrializing, they were sort of do in our construction timelines and getting this thing built is determined by how we pay for it. One of the things that happened that was really unique, the city of Detroit does not always have money to do nice things like this. Unfortunately, it's just the reality of living in a city that struggles with poverty and deindustrialization. But during 2021, the Biden administration passed what was called the American Rescue Plan Act after COVID to reinvest in our communities, to support struggling communities after the pandemic. And through that, the state of Michigan allocated about $200 million to the Joe Louis Greenway project. They were allocating a lot of their funds to parks and recreation projects across the state, and they really prioritized the Joe Louis Greenway as one of those projects. So a really big chunk of money came from the state of Michigan. And then we got another $20 million in ARPA from Wayne County for the section in Highland Park, another city that struggles with funding. So Wayne County was able to support in that way. Yep.
So who played the big part of allocating the money to this project? The representatives play a part as well?
So in securing that money, at that time, I know that it's always a big mix of people. So there were people in the mayor's office who were supporting the lobbying effort. We especially had some folks at the mayor's office who had a deep relationship with the state. Unique role where her name is Megan. She was originally involved in planning the Greenway and the framework plan, and she got promoted to work in the office of the chief financial officer. So she lobbied from that role for the Greenway project. And then there was also just the planning staff that supported in that. We want letters of support from the community to show there's community support. We want letters of support if it's a state or federal grant from those state and federal representatives. So people at those levels of government that say, hey, this is in my district, and this is a really important project for my district. I'd like to see this funded, and they can have those discussions at the state level with the governor and the legislative body to get that approved. So those are sort of the big parts of my work. It's really, if I broke it down into two parts, or I would say three actually, it's on one hand, we're doing planning and design work. So where the Greenway goes, what it looks like. So doing the engineering and design. The second bucket is community engagement. So talking to people. Into the Trump administration, they care about very different things. And so we have to totally change how we think about what we're requesting from the federal government now. And then at the local level, we have a new mayor. So also thinking about how that works in that conversation and how that needs to change and adapting to new mayoral priorities. Yep.
There's a big section that addresses by
yes.
Our school. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so I think I'll talk about two angles there. So right now we're right on the border of the city of Dearborn. So this bridge here is actually, in half of this property. This is the city line. We're right on it as we speak. And so the Greenway is going to hit, when it hits Warren here, it'll go into Warren. You see that turn where it turns at number 1 on your map. It goes down Warren to Lanyo, and then it turns left back to Detroit. And so you'll see part of it on that map is already funded. That little yellow line along Lanyo, right here, that's Romanowski Park. And we actually got funding from the state of Michigan. There's a grant program called the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund. Basically, whenever the city sells concessions for oil or mineral extraction, they get some funding. They collect it into a trust fund, and then the state disperses that to their municipalities around the state to invest in recreation, natural resource conservation. So it's sort of this trade-off. You have this negative impact on the environment so you'll see the Greenway actually pretty close to where you guys are, making that connection. And hopefully one day it'll be able to connect back here to the Warren Gateway. We're still working with the city of Dearborn. We're working on the segment in Lanyo. It's a pretty big project, so it still is going to take a lot of funding to rebuild the street there.
exactly what's gonna be there? Lanya?
On Lanyo, we're building a path, sort of parallel to Lanyo. So it's going to be a shared use path for bicyclists and pedestrians. I know that we were able to secure a little bit more funding to add some additional paths into the park itself, beyond just the greenway. And then there will be wayfinding. So at each end, there will be sort of if you look here, like our signage towers to guide people to different sections of the path. And then I don't have the plan in front of me, but I believe there's also some landscaping elements. Because it's in a park, the city of Detroit does not currently have security forward with that. I think it's a little bit contentious, concerns around surveillance in parks. But in terms of the greenway itself, we've sort of followed the model of the Detroit Riverfront, where every 500 feet we have a security tower. And it's monitored 24 hours by the City of Detroit security team, the General Services Department security team. So we have park security, we have parks maintenance. The City of Detroit maintains it on both fronts. Any questions for me? I feel like that's a long overview of the project.
Questions?
Yeah, I'm going to be honest with you. I think any participation in local government is valuable. In my mind, I like actually getting involved in the work on the ground. So I'd encourage you to pursue a degree in planning and get involved in the work of actually making changes to your community like this. So if you're interested.
Talk a little bit about that series. What does Detroit, what's
Yeah, so if you were to pursue it in, most schools have there's other opportunities as well. So you could find an area that you're passionate about and pursue that path. I will say, as sort of a fun fact, a few years ago, the planning team for the Greenway was me and my colleague Hanan Yahya. So it was a almost all Yemeni planning team.
President of the student government at UA since 2012.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. So a former UA student. That's true. So some good Yemeni representation on the team. So if you guys see me doing this work, I'd like to see you, think about yourself and potentially doing a role like this or working in government more broadly. I'll say, there's a lot of transit investment happening now. There's, I think, I haven't been following it as closely in recent years, but I know the state approved a lot of new funding for the bus system. I will say the transit system in Metro Detroit needs a lot of work. So, if you go to a city like Chicago, New York, Seattle, Los Angeles, they all have really robust transit systems. And when you go to somewhere like Europe or Asia, even those systems kind of pale in comparison. So we have a lot of work to do on our bus system here. There's challenges around funding and getting the infrastructure built and operated over time. We spend probably the least of any city in the United States to come at, every 10 minutes, every 5 minutes.
Continue.
Yeah, and, there's also the question of does the bus ridership, do you build bus systems or train systems around the people that use it now? Or do you need to build it and then people will use it because it's useful? So that is something that a planner has to sort of balance is, nobody's using the bus system now, but there's always this example of you can't justify a bridge by how many people are swimming across a river, right? So you're not going to know if a bridge is going to be useful by looking at the water and saying nobody's crossing the river now, so why should we build a bridge? So you have to think about the future as a planner and who might use it, how might we make sure that it's useful and connect places that people need to get to. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, anything else you'd like to add, Idrees?
I think that's it.
Okay.